All right. Good morning. Can everybody hear me on the phone, on the Zoom? Maybe, maybe not. Probably. Yes.
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us. My name is Max Woods. I'm with the Oregon Department of Energy. We are here in Pendleton and virtual, running a hybrid meeting. We're going to get started here. And we got a lot of content. We're going to go through a lot of information about the Oregon Energy Security Plan and where we're at in that process. Maybe we'll do some quick introductions just so we know both who we're talking to and who's talking with us. Again, Max Woods from the Department of Energy. I'm joined in the room here by my colleague, Deanna Henry.
Hi, everyone.
We have one of these meeting owls, by the way, in the room, so it will track around. You can probably see who we are. From our contracting team at CNA, we have Dr. Casey Stedman.
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
And Andrew Eisberg. Hey, everybody. Okay. If everybody wouldn't mind, I would like to hear who's on the Zoom, if that's okay. Do we unmute people, Andrew? People can just say hi.
We can go down the list.
Yeah.
See, we'll start with Andy.
Andy Fletcher, Columbia Basin Electric, Heppner, Oregon.
Thank you, Andy. Joseph.
Morning, everyone. I'm Joe Basil. I'm in Enterprise, Oregon, work with Wallowa Resources. I'm the Community Energy Program Manager.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Michael.
Yeah, Mike Mercer here. Here also Joseph, Oregon, and sitting on a committee with Joseph around the Community Energy Resiliency Plan.
Great, thank you. Eric.
Good morning, Eric Bush, Grant County Emergency Management Coordinator.
Jeff.
Yes, Jeff Blend. I am Montana's energy security lead, ESF 12, and I work on our security plan here in Montana.
Jeff, it's nice to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Next up, Nick.
Good morning, I'm Nick Vora. I'm the Union County Emergency Manager, and I apologize. I'll be coming and going a little bit during the meeting. I'm out running some errands at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
And Rich.
Rich Harriman, Malheur County Emergency Manager.
I believe that's everybody. If I missed anyone, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to everybody.
All right, very good. Thanks everybody for joining. You know, with the breadth and sort of geographic territory of what's called the Eastern region, Eastern Oregon, I really appreciate the opportunity for people to come in here on the Zoom and talk to us, get to know us a little bit, learn about the project we're doing right now. And I will give you here's the big release right now. We're going to put you to work. This isn't just we have a lot of information to share, but we're also going to be looking for your feedback and input throughout this presentation. I hope that's okay. So at your computer, if you can see the screen right now, there is a link and a QR code to a tool called Slido. If you're on a computer, the link will work for you and it'll take you to a website that not quite now, but when we get going, well, we're going to ask you a series of questions and ask for some input and gather your feedback on sort of what we're talking about here today. We really want to get your information and try to make this not so much the typical one-way Zoom presentations that we've all sat through over the years, but try to make it a little more interactive. So hope that's okay. Try the link, make sure it works. We'll get to that throughout the presentation. So here's our title page again. All right, quick agenda, what we're going to talk about today. The Energy Security Plan, statewide, this is a statewide plan. We're here in the Eastern region, and we will have some content that's focused on the region. We also have some content that's sort of broad statewide. We'll kind of get to that in a minute here. Talking about our project, just timeline, basics, some methods, what we've done so far, how we've done it. And then we're going to release some results. We talk a little bit about fuel We also, and just to kind of set the stage here, the energy security plan is about all forms of energy in the state: electricity, natural gas, liquid fuels, propane. State doesn't use a ton of propane, but those are the primary focus areas for the project. Although we do have some specific content about fuels, and we'll kind of get to that in a little bit here. We have some stakeholder engagement feedback results we're going to share. We're going to do roll out some risk analysis, some technical results that I think people will find pretty interesting. We'll talk about mitigation measures, and then off we go. Okay, quick summary, just who we are. If we haven't worked together before, you haven't come into contact with the Oregon Department of Energy, with the State Energy Office. We do a lot of things. Energy security and resilience is one of those things. That's what my team focuses on. We also handle nuclear safety, by the way, of which I unfortunately scheduled this meeting at the same time as a nuclear emergency drill from the Hanford site. So some people here in Morrow and Umatilla counties, I know are occupied with that emergency drill. So that's my fault for scheduling that, but so it goes. We have a lot of things happening. And you can see the other stuff that Odo does. Maybe you've come into contact with Odo, as we call ourselves, throughout the years. Just a quick summary on why we're here, what we're talking about today. I talked about that before, but talking about the project, share some results, and get input. I say regional input. And then just to give a note that we are traveling across the state this week and next week. On Tuesday, we were in Tillamook, yesterday in Portland, today, Pendleton. Next week, we'll have a meeting in Bend, Salem, and Medford. The state, we've used Oregon Department of Emergency Management's 6 regions for the state to try and just organize our project and use the OEM or ODEM, I guess, as they are now, use those regions. We'll talk about that a little bit and why that matters here in a second. And just who we are again, Odo, I mentioned our contractors from CNA. They've partnered with an engineering firm called Haley and Aldrich. I don't know if folks maybe are familiar with Haley and Aldrich, but they do a lot of work in the western part of the state around seismic risk, geotechnical hazards, and that sort of thing. So we have a good team. Oregon PUC staff, mission staff, has worked closely with us on our project. Just so folks know, the PUC staff has been deeply involved. And then, and you, everybody else. So there we go. Okay. Talk about why are we doing this? Why are we doing a state energy security plan? It's a good idea. That's number one. It's a good idea. It's a good idea for the state of Oregon to consider the energy security, energy resilience, and how the state can help local partners, local governments, emergency managers, utilities, fuel providers, private companies, everybody involved in energy to try and make our state more resilient, more secure. That's the concept. We're also doing this because the federal government and the state government told us to do so. And so this slide has a kind of a couple points on that. The federal government, through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was passed by Congress in the fall of 2021, which put some money into this program. It also put a requirement that all states, and Jeff from Montana, you can attest to this, all states have to have a state energy security plan. Those plans are actually, when we're done with our plan, it'll be reviewed and scored by US Department of Energy. And they've hired Pacific Northwest National Lab to help with that. It'll be a technical review of my project, of our work, done by the feds to make sure that it's aligned with the required contents, which are here listed. I won't read them to you, from Congress. Their hook is that they both give us funding to do this project, and they can withhold future funding if we don't have a compliant plan. So that's the financial incentive for us to do a good job at our job. But it's also a good plan, as I mentioned. Oh, go back just a little bit. The state also, state legislature under Senate Bill 1567 required us to do this as well, and directed my agency, the Oregon Department of Energy, to be the lead on this project. We call it SB 1567. We'll talk about this a little bit later. It has some additional requirements, Oregon specific, in addition to the federal requirements. The state legislature wanted us to look a little closer at fuel, liquid fuels, diesel, gasoline, jet, and how it could be affected in the state, and sort of ways to make ourselves more resilient on the fuel side. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, here's our top line goal. can read the words in blue and with a red underline sort of addition there. The blue words are from federal definition of energy security. We at the state have added in the underlined red that says at an affordable price to really to make a note and highlight that affordability and cost matters for consumers, it matters for utilities, it matters for investment decisions. I'll say that in a form of energy security or insecurity, if you can't afford fuel or electricity, that's not a good thing, even if the supply is available. And when you think about mitigation that could be done to reduce risks, cost also matters. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And sort of there's a declining value of investment decisions you could make that cost just kind of goes up quite high at some of those choices. We'll get to that a little bit later, but we wanted to highlight that piece. Here's the strategy. We don't pretend to know everything or that we're doing everything for the state. What we're really trying to do is coordinate a lot of different efforts at the state level and local level, utility level, to bring together existing information, recognizing that a lot of work's been done and is being done right now in this field by our partners. And we are doing some new analysis, some original analysis. We'll get to that here, but I wanted just to make a note that we know that work's being done in this sector, and we're trying to, at the state level, to help coordinate that from the state perspective to find the best way that we can to, like I said, help everybody increase our resilience and security. All right, a little bit note before we kind of get going into the content. This is a fuel piece that I mentioned, fuel resilience. Senate Bill 1567 from the state legislature directs us to do these things. Recognize that here in the eastern region, the Cascadia subduction zone 9.0 earthquake may seem far away. You may think it doesn't affect you, and all the science says the shaking will likely not affect you from the shaking perspective of an earthquake, but it will affect you from distribution of fuel, and it may affect you from electricity, because considering sort of how the networks could be damaged. Fuel in the state, even here, mostly comes from the Port of Portland fuel terminals and is distributed out by truck across our state. We've got some slides to kind of show the mapping of where fuel goes in the state here. But just keep this in mind, that even if you're not, your buildings aren't damaged by an earthquake, you may have be very impacted from the energy perspective by a megaquake. So the state's asked us to look at our facilities, mostly public facilities across the state that have fuel, and consider ways to increase capacity of fuel. The idea being that if we have more fuel on site, even if it's a small amount, at a time of an emergency, that fuel could be used for emergency response purposes. You know, by thinking about how long it might take for fuel to get to the region, it's better to have more supply on hand for that immediate response. We'll kind of get to that a little bit here in a bit. Okay, more slide here with that QR code that takes you, I believe, to our website. There's a little link there. That's our project email. Basically, we've got a lot of ways to get in touch with us, stay in touch with us, and we'd like to connect with everybody here. This is really a note of what we've done. We've done surveys. Public sector, we've also done private sector surveys, primarily utilities and fuel companies. So if you're on this call from a utility, you probably got an email from me or my colleague asking you to help us with a survey a few months ago. We just want to recognize that's happened. I think that's the end of my, one more slide here on the introduction, sort of the lead in remaining work. So we're doing these meetings. I mentioned that we're going across the state. This week and next week, we have to do we have a couple big things left. Assessing the fuel storage capacity and areas for increased storage. That's a big piece of work that's yet to come this summer. Data collection is mostly done, and now it's some analysis on those fuel locations and putting some criteria around what we might be looking for to increase fuel capacity in the future. Anyway, we'll get to that. Crossing the T's, dotting the I's for our September submittal. The deadline for our plan is the end of September. We have to submit it to U.S. Department of Energy, our federal partners, and then, as I mentioned, they'll score and grade us. The last point here is really something I want to mention and emphasize throughout this whole meeting is we are both required by the feds, U.S. DOE, and the state to review and update our plan on a regular basis, every year, every other year. we're taking that to heart. And so this is really the first iteration of our plan, this 2024 plan. It's not going to be everything. And I know that. We're doing our best to make sure it's an awesome document, but it's not going to do everything we want, which is okay, because we're going to keep working 2025, 2026 and beyond, to keep talking with people, to gather more data, to do more analysis, to be open for how things will change in the future. New risks may be coming more apparent, and we want to be able to address and consider those in future iterations of our plan. So thanks for your help today on this project in 2024. If you feel like we've really missed something or you want to talk more, that's okay, because we have opportunities every year to keep working on this project. And really, this is our first big effort, and we've got a lot of work yet to come. At that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Casey Stedman, and she's going to lead the next piece of the presentation here.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us today, everybody. What I'm going to start with is giving you an overview of the project timeline and the structure, how we're approaching the objectives that we're trying to meet. And so that's where I want to start, is with our objectives. So as a reminder, we're working to identify, assess, and mitigate risks to our energy infrastructure in order that we can plan for, respond to, and recover from events that could disrupt our energy supply. And so as we're working towards these objectives, we're approaching it through a series of efforts that starts with stakeholder engagement. So the Gantt chart on the slide right now at the very top is representing our stakeholder engagement efforts. They started at the end of last year when we were really getting the project up and running, and they span the entire timeline of the project. So they'll wrap up this summer. And I'll give you a little more detail as to what those engagement efforts have looked like. We also spent a large amount of effort focused on data collection. Our technical analysis is very data intense, and so we really concentrated on getting the most robust and highest quality data that we could get our hands on. We performed the risk assessment, which I'll give you an overview of some of those preliminary results today. And then from all of that feedback, literature review, et cetera, we were able to reach a point of compiling some risk mitigation measures that we're going to present to you today. And this is where we're going to really rely heavily on you guys to help us understand how those mitigation measures should be prioritized specifically in your region, because the priorities obviously will vary region to region. And then, as Max mentioned, we do have the fuel storage portion of this project that spans a good timeline throughout the project as well. So the spatial structure of the project is we adopted the 6 regions as defined by OEM. It sounds like many of you on this call may already be familiar with this map that's on the left of the screen here. Each of the regions are color-coded. And then, of course, we're reaching out to the tribal governments as well to understand their unique priorities. Here's a snapshot on the right of just the distribution of their headquarters across the state. Within the energy sector itself, we're focusing on 3 primary areas of electricity, natural gas, and liquid fuels. So you will see things organized in this manner throughout the talk today. So a little bit more on our project stakeholder engagement efforts. We started with the kickoff meeting, and then these 2 yellow bars that are overlapping in time. One of them is focused on the private sector, the other is public sector. In both of these arenas, we did request data, as I mentioned before, and then we also were really working to better understand the threats that are impacting the energy sector across the state. So we're wanting to get the perspective specifically from the private sector, and then also what is unique to each of the 6 regions statewide. We do have engagement efforts around the fuel storage component of the project. And then right now we're in the middle of what we refer to as the Roadshow, this series of meetings where we're traveling across the state and with the tribal governments to get feedback largely on these risk mitigation measures. And then, of course, we'll roll out the project as we wrap up. And so this is just a snapshot of where we are in the Roadshow. As Max mentioned, we've met with the Northwest region and Portland Metro, and today now, of course, we're with you guys in the Eastern region. So with our methods, we put a link in the chat for you guys to access a handout. So if you don't have that up, you're welcome to refer to that now, and you'll have more detailed images of these maps that are just small screenshots on the slide right now. We don't have time to get into each of the details for these maps, but we want you to have them for reference as you're considering the risk mitigation measures later on. And so we included a series of maps for the electricity subsector. The first one is focused on sourcing. So this is looking at the different types of power plants and sources and capacity and so on throughout the state. The next map is focused on transmission. So these, primary transmission lines statewide. And then we have one on customers, which I'll actually get into a little bit of detail in the next slide. For natural gas, we're summarizing everything in one map. So you have sourcing and transmission and the service providers all summarized in one location. For liquid fuels, we have actually quite a large collection of maps because there are several commodities that would fall within this subsector. We're using diesel here as an example. So you have one focused on sourcing. This is how we're importing diesel into the state, whether it's by pipeline, maritime. We also have truck and railroad highlighted on that map. And then we have one specific to distribution. And so here we did a routing analysis that can help us to understand what some of the primary roadways are that trucks take in distributing diesel. So that I would touch on the customers map a little bit more for electricity. So in this one, what I'm wanting to highlight is that we have 41 utilities across the state, and 3 of those are investor-owned utilities. In this map, we have a pie chart for every county in the state, and those pie charts are sized based on the number of customers served across all of those utilities. And the red slices of the pie represent the investor-owned utilities. So you can see that the IOUs do play a prominent role throughout most of the counties in the state. In your region, in the eastern region, you can see that a lot of your slices of the pie are blue. These are the cooperative-owned utilities. And then, of course, we do also have some municipal utilities and people's utility districts throughout the state. The municipals in yellow, people's is in orange. So after we do all of our preliminary analysis, we're able to narrow down the types of threats that we will consider for the risk assessment. And they're summarized in this slide here. So on the left-hand side, you have all of our natural hazards. So first we do have the Cascadia subduction zone, earthquake and tsunami. This is looking at the big one, the 9.0. And then we have drought, flood, lightning, wildfire, windstorm, and winter storm. And then we have human-caused threats on the right. And these are specifically cyber attacks and physical attacks. Something important to note here is the human-caused threats are defined as intentional attacks on energy systems. So this would not include something like a car accident that would damage infrastructure. These have to be intentional attacks. For the natural hazards, we're able to do geospatial analysis to define hazard zones. And so this is a snapshot really of just the variability of those hazard zones across the different types of threats. And so we have something like a flood hazard in the top right that has the spatial extent is somewhat limited. It doesn't cover a big area statewide relative to other threats. But the distribution is, you can see that it is a concern in all 6 of the regions statewide. In comparison, right next to it, we have drought, not a big concern in all of the regions, but where it is a concern, the extent is quite large. And of course, we do have the Cascadia event in the 2 maps on the top left. These are the high and the very high risk areas. And so while you guys aren't designated as being within the hazard zone here, that doesn't mean that there's absolutely no risk to any of the area in the eastern region. It's just that y'all aren't on that very high end. So going back to these hazards, what our technical analysis, our approach does is it looks at these hazard zones in relation to the infrastructure, the different types of assets, where they're located, and the flow of different commodities. And through this analysis, we can determine how vulnerable a certain region would be and a certain energy system to different threats. And this approach is very data intense. And for the liquid fuels subsector, we were able to secure data to conduct our analysis. But given the time constraints of this project, for the electric and natural gas subsectors, we were not able to secure data that gave us confidence that the technical analysis would be robust. And so what we needed to do was pivot. And what we did is we created something that we're calling the hybrid survey. And we structured this self-assessment around our technical analysis approach. And so that gives us 2 parallel approaches to come to the same outcomes. And we presented this survey, this self-assessment, to the utilities, and they gave us feedback that allowed us to calculate vulnerability scores. And I'll walk through that in just a minute. So for technical analysis, we use that approach for liquid fuels and natural hazards. And then the hybrid analysis is what we implemented for the electric and natural gas subsectors for natural hazards. Human-caused threats by nature can't really be defined as hazard zones as we can for the natural hazards in like the maps in the previous slide. And just because of the nature of these threats. And so for the human-caused threats, we opted to also implement the hybrid survey across all 3 of the subsectors. And so here's an overview of how we structured the analysis. We broke it into 4 categories. First, we're looking at exposure. And to determine exposure, we looked at things like historical events, future projections, simulations, combinations of any of those 3, depending on what data was available for what threat. And through that, we can determine which assets would be exposed to a threat and how frequently they're likely to be exposed. And then we looked at sensitivity. So these are the inherent qualities of different assets that can give us information around how they would be affected by a given threat. And now we're looking at just how many of these system elements are actually sensitive to the different threats. Potential impact is considering the customers that would be impacted and the time it would take to restore service. And then for adaptive capacity, we considered a number of different measures, some of them physical, some of them operational. Here we are using operational in a very broad term. And then we also looked at the maturity of these different measures. So when a utility company or a service provider is implementing this measure, how mature is their implementation? And so what we can do is take all of this data and simplify it down into a rating system. So each of these 4 categories would end up with a rating that fell somewhere between 0 and 3. And we simply add those together to get a final overall vulnerability ranking. It would be somewhere between 0 and 10. And so here we have an example of a scenario where we have high exposure. So we'd get a score of 3, high sensitivity with a rating of 1, high potential impact, also a rating of 3. And then the adaptive capacity is very high. So a lot of risk mitigation measures have already been implemented to a great extent to adapt to a given threat. And this rating system is inverse. So the score here would be a 0. So we add these 4 final ratings together, and that gives us our overall vulnerability ranking of 7, which would fall into the range of a moderate level of vulnerability. So with that, you guys have an overview of how we're approaching the objectives that we're trying to achieve through this work. And what we're going to do whenever we come back from break is start to interact more with you guys and start really soliciting your feedback so that you can shape this final the final ESP. And so if you haven't yet joined us on Slido, please take a moment to do so. As Max mentioned before, you can use the QR code. We have found that it's a little bit cumbersome on a smartphone, so you would likely prefer to do this on your computer, your laptop. And so follow the link that's in the chat and go ahead and get connected. And when we return, we're going to present you guys some preliminary results and get your feedback as we work through those different categories of preliminary results. So we'll go ahead and take 5 minutes and make sure everybody has a chance to get connected if you need to step away for a minute. And we'll see you back here at 9:40.
Okay. All right, thanks, everybody. I just want to take a quick pause and see if there's any questions so far about what we've gone through. You can either raise your hand and be formal and polite, or just come off mute and start talking. That's okay too. Totally fine. But if there's any questions, be okay now. If not, I'll kind of roll into some results here about fuel. So I mentioned this earlier. This is under the directive from the state legislature for Senate Bill 1567, was to relate as to we can summarize what a lengthy bill talked about, was assessing the fuel storage capacity and recommended areas to increase storage. So to gather, we had to collect information, and then we had to map it, and we've done that. The two major sources of data that we collected was from Oregon DEQ and Oregon State Fire Marshal. People may be familiar with this, and DEQ regulates underground fuel storage tanks, and the Fire Marshal regulates and permits above ground tanks. And so we have two different agencies collecting data. So fortunately, we were able to get their information. And what I believe is the first time on a statewide effort, we have mapped all the fuel storage locations, at least that are registered with state partners, map them all on one map. Now I recognize there's a lot of dots on a slide here. That's okay. The important thing we just want to show is sort of the context for locations across the whole state. First, we have a slide that's a little focused on the eastern region. Next, about storage capacity for fuel. There's a lot of information on this slide. You can just kind of see this total number, 414 million gallons of liquid fuels and 8,800 tanks. The capacity numbers are, there's a little bit of an estimation there because tanks are never full of fuel by regulation. You're not supposed to fill them, I think, 90% for the capacity. But of course, using fuel, there's always in a state of flux. Nevertheless, here we go. A lot of gasoline, a lot of diesel, a lot of jet, and then other fuels listed there. Pie charts, just for kind of discussion points, the pie charts on the map show fuel storage, and it's broken out by type. The size of the chart demonstrates the total volume of fuel in a region. And I'll note that this map at the little bottom says excludes terminal storage capacity. So the three major terminals in the state are Port of Portland area, Eugene, and in Umatilla. We took those terminals off because they sort of dwarfed, they made the map really out of proportion. You couldn't really even see that Port of Portland fuel terminals just dwarfs the rest of the state's capacity. But even without those terminals, you can see that where all the storage of fuel is located. Not surprising, Portland Metro Region, Multnomah, Clackamas, Washington, Columbia counties have a lot of fuel storage, and then sort of smaller amounts across the state. By the way, this information, GIS data will eventually be available for use. It's not quite ready yet, so this is a bit of a preview, but we'll have it available on state websites where you can access it, and we'll make sure people know when it's available. All right. This is a little more information about the East region. You can see the capacity number there, 569,000 gallons, 166 tanks, and then the breakout between gasoline and diesel. Very little, if any, sort of de minimis amounts of jet fuel stored, well, not de minimis, but very little amounts of jet fuel stored. Just didn't really show up on the map, frankly. But there you go. This map, what it also shows is public sector fuel capacity. Part of the charge from SB 1567, really not part of it, but the directive was to look specifically at public sector fuel facilities. Think public works yards primarily, other types of facilities, government-owned facilities, as well as government, we call government partners. Those are kind of the turquoise dots. Government partners are utilities, universities or colleges or public institutions, a few other sort of entities that might be quasi-government, shall we say, that might have fuel. And what the map shows, you can see where the public locations are on the map. The blue being government, turquoise quasi-government. This is our starting place, so if I can say that, for looking at future capacity increase discussions across the eastern region, across the state. This is the information we needed to really get going and think about where potential future additions to capacity could be considered. So this map, sort of similar map, but with the pink reddish shading on the west part of the state, shows the Cascadia subduction zone 9.0 earthquake shaking potential or impact potential. And you can see people in the western part of the state will have, sounds obvious, major shaking, major damage. It's also where most of the fuel is located. And so we will be reliant upon other sources of fuel, the fuel capacity that's still standing in the western part of the state, plus fuel capacity in the Cascade region, Central Oregon, and Eastern region that might still have fuel to more likely, use on site, so we don't have to worry about bringing fuel to you, or if capacity is available to share fuel for emergency response in the western part of the state. This is just sort of in a theoretical Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. Wanted to kind of lay it out here and show the impact zone from the major earthquake compared to the tank capacity. Of course, there's other emergencies that happen much more frequently on an annual basis: wildfires, winter storms, wind, etc., that cause impacts to our energy systems and potentially fuel distribution as well. So we're aware of that, and this, just for discussion points, shows only the Cascadia zone impact zone, but other impacts, other hazards affect our state, of course. So the very last bullet here, that's an acronym, Energy Security Plan, will include screening criteria for optimal fuel expansion. Really, that means we're developing, when we go out and start talking to owners of fuel tanks and say, hey, would you consider having some additional capacity, another tank maybe? We want to make sure that there's a criteria around where the state would consider future investments or consider helping out with additional tank, and make sure that that tank is in a safe area, seismically resilient, accessible with road access, perhaps out of a floodplain zone, things like that. So, not make sure we're investing in the right place. All right. Okay, one more thing. Fuel capacity next steps. This is my last slide on fuel. So one of the directives from the legislation is also that before any recommendations are made on locations to expand capacity, that we have to go talk to those communities and the neighbors that are around a tank facility. So we will do that maybe this summer, but kind of looking at schedule and analysis, maybe later in the year, to actually talk to people, talk to local governments, county and cities, and get input on, what the communities think about potential expansions of tank fuel. I guess I should caveat all this, and maybe I should say at this beginning, we're probably not talking about major terminal size fuel capacity. In my mind, it's more in the, couple 1,000-gallon tank. Maybe you have 1,000 gallons of diesel at your public works yard, and you could use another 1,000 gallons. And during normal operations, you could use that fuel, capacity's there. And if there was an emergency, you'd have additional supply on hand. We're not talking about the 1,000,000-gallon Port of Portland terminal size tanks. Those are just too big and too much and too expensive. A lot of other things there. So a much more smaller capacity we're considering here. But nevertheless, here you go. You can see the map, Eastern region with the dots where we've identified fuel locations. And a little shout out here in the middle. If anybody is the owner or operator of one of those facilities, please give me a call. I might cold call you in the future if your facility is on our list. Okay, that's on fuel. Any questions online?
We got one from Eric Bush. Have you compared your assumptions on the eastern region of a 9.0 against the data posted in HAC View by Oregon Dogami? Geology and knowledge.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. With the information we have on the Cascadia earthquake expectation, the future shaking scenarios comes from Dogami and from Dogami's consultants that prepared that analysis. Yeah, that's where we got that information.
And it's the high and very high ratings.
Okay.
That's why it's limited to the coast. That's what the cutoff.
That's what
is.
the cutoff was, yes,
Yeah.
but everybody heard that. There's sort of a range that's categorized for the impact zone. And Casey just mentioned that the pink that we showed on that map was high and very high, like
Risk.
damage,
Yeah.
impact, hazard, I'm not sure exactly the right word. But that's where, and so you can see on those previous maps, you can see, there will be impact, for the eastern part of the Willamette Valley up into the foothills of the Cascades. It's not shown on the map, because we only highlighted the high and very high risk zones. So that's sort of where that information came from, what it's showing. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. So, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Raise my hand. I just had a quick comment on your response. And the reason I asked the question was, we're obviously getting in Oregon and ODM, we're getting ready for an exercise, iron ore. And one of the things that we're doing is we're using HasView to evaluate, actual data, for that scenario. And it's a 9-0 scenario. So when I'm looking at HasView for Grant County in particular, if you want to go back to the last slide, there's indications of strong shaking on essentially, if you were to draw a line north and south, right up 395, if you will, between Pendleton and all the way down south through Harney County. Everything west of that is, and I'm making a generalization, Dogami has a lot more fidelity, but there's areas that they're actually listed as being strong shaking, and then there's areas that are listed as moderate shaking, and the stronger areas tend to be the ground lines of communication corridors. And I'm just speaking for my county, but a lot of the issues we have, even light shaking is going to create problems with ground lines, with the highways and ground lines of communication for us because of the nature of our 2-lane highways and the rugged terrain and the rock. On good days, we have regular rock falls on 26 between John Day and Western county line. So I know I'm kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but from my perspective as a local, I just want to make sure that we're not making assumptions that are too broad.
Yeah, Eric, I really appreciate that. Well, let's keep talking. We'll go back and sort of make sure we're, looking at, I think the high and very high impact to the western part of the state, you'll know that, but you're right. State is not consistent across the state. And to your point, impacts very well can be felt here, or in Pendleton right now. As well as across the eastern region. From shake, and maybe I said this earlier, maybe I'll walk that back a little bit. Ground shaking impacts could very well still be felt here. Let alone impacts to distribution, roads, bridges, etc. I'll be part of that iron ore 24 exercise. So we can certainly talk fuel coming up into that scenario, or energy, broadly speaking, up into that exercise. And I'd like to make sure that our current plan, and perhaps future iterations of the plan, is thoughtful to your point, and not just gets sort of myopic on what happens to Lincoln City and Newport and sort of the coastal communities, which are, no doubt at risk from major earthquake, but there is other impacts across the state. In fact, my colleague Deanna Henry, who's in the room here, is on the planning committee for Iron Ore 24. So we're certainly looking forward to that exercise to work out fuel. So my agency, in addition to this energy security plan, we're also the ESF, Emergency Support Function 12, for fuel for the state. You probably know that PUC handles electricity and natural gas. We handle fuel, that's me and Deanna, another colleague of ours. So in addition to this broad level planning, we're also on the emergency response side with fuel. So keen interest in how that fuel is able to be moved around in the state and potential impacts and risks that might come from an earthquake or from other, fires, other disasters that could affect it. So.
And Eric, I just do want to mention that we're just building a proposed list. So anyone who has a facility that meet a certain criteria can give us their interest, and it gets on a list, and all these facilities will be vetted across all kinds of dogami requirements for what seismically sound, the islanding and the mapping that the Department of Human Services is doing for what the state will look like after a Cascadia event and what the islands will look like. I think there are 31 of them, including cross-checking it with the risk assessment that our contracting team has done. So there's going to be a lot of vetting and evaluating of these sites before we come up with a short list to recommend to state legislators to consider.
Great.
And I'd like to just also, kind of apply the same concept to all of the hazard maps, because for each of these, we have to determine a threshold, right, to outline the highest risk areas. But even if a part of the state doesn't fall within what we're delineating as a hazard zone, that doesn't mean that that portion of the state wouldn't experience that threat. So maybe, obviously wildfires could occur in regions that aren't highlighted as the highest risk areas. So it doesn't mean that it's never going to occur. It's just that the risks, the areas that are being delineated as the hazard zones are the ones that fall into the highest risk category. So just some context there across all of the threats as well. Are there any other questions before we jump onto Slido for the first time? Okay. So at this point, we're going to walk through Slido a few questions at a time. So please don't feel like you have to go on and answer all of them at once. We'll give you a prompt, give you some context, and then ask for your feedback. So your very first question in Slido is just asking if you're interested in engaging with Odo to increase fuel storage capacity. So Max said he might be calling you later on. If you definitely want him to call you, please let us know right now in Slido, and we'll add you to the list of folks that we can reach out to. And with so many of you guys online today, we want to make sure that everybody has time to answer the questions. So sometimes there'll be a few questions all at once. And so we will ask that once you're done answering, giving your input in Slido, go ahead and raise your hand. And that way we can see how many folks have wrapped things up versus how many folks need a little more time to give us feedback. And that can just help us understand. So I'll give you.
We did have one question.
Okay.
From Jeff Blend. Our state is not funded for fuel storage, nor does our state government have an emergency contract. Where do you get your funding for purchasing fuel and storing it?
Thanks, Jeff. Odo we don't own fuel storage capacity, but other state agencies do. But I imagine, Jeff, what we're thinking here, Oregon Department of Transportation, Oregon Department of Administrative Services has a motor pool fuel yard. It's not that, but it's a motor pool has a fuel yard in Salem. So the state government does have fuel and fuel tanks, not my agency, but other agencies do. Department of Corrections actually at the prison systems have a lot of fuel. And the parks and recreation at park sites often have fuel capacity as well. So I would recommend you just kind of talk to all your state partners, and even ones you may not have considered, like parks, might have fuel that you could map and start talking about, how they use that fuel and what their needs might be in the future. Yeah.
And we don't have a funding plan currently to support in expanding fuel storage. So like Max said, we're going to be looking towards the state agencies or, county, if that's something you want to do. I think Max has an incentive package that he might be, looking for additional funds for projects like this in the future.
Yeah, I should be clear about that. To be, our directive from the state legislature was to go out and do this assessment that we're talking about here and go back to the legislature and say, okay, here's what we've done. Here's our work. Let's start talking about incentives, about money, and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the other categories of preliminary results here. And we're going to have a rhythm to our interaction for this portion of the meeting. And so what we're going to start with is feedback from our stakeholders thus far. So I'm going to let you know who has been engaging with us, what they've been telling us, what their feedback is, and then we'll do a quick check-in on Slido. And then we'll move on to the preliminary results for the risk assessment. And we're going to categorize this by each of the energy subsectors. So we'll start with electricity, then natural gas, then liquid fuels. And again, I'll let you know who engaged with us, what the final vulnerability rankings were in the form of a matrix. I'll dig in a little bit into adaptive capacity to give you some context there. and then we'll do a check-in. So we'll follow that same rhythm for each of the three subsectors. And then finally, we'll get into risk mitigation measures. We've broken this into 4 categories. So first we have very high level measures that we're proposing that would apply to all systems. So these are very general. And then we'll go into a little more detail for the electricity, natural gas, and liquid fuel subsectors. And in this phase, we're really going to spend more time giving you guys an opportunity to inform us. So spending more time in Slido than we will having with me talking to you guys. So I'll tee up the risk mitigation measures for you, and then you'll spend some time in Slido prioritizing them, letting us understand what would be most important specifically for the Eastern region. So let's get started with stakeholder engagement. First of all, who has been giving us information thus far? Well, we have about 144 folks that have been participating, and you can see their distribution across the state in the map on the left. So here we have a circle that's sized based on the number of people that have participated, color-coded for each of the 6 regions across the state. So you can see the majority of folks do come from the Portland Metro and Willamette Valley regions, but we do have representation across all 6 regions in the state. In the top right, you can see that the majority of folks are associated with the government. That's the bright yellow box that's biggest. We also have a good number of consumer-owned utilities, folks from the private sector, nonprofits. And then to our knowledge, 15% of the folks who've engaged with us thus far are associated with environmental justice issues in some way. So what have we been asking folks? One of the most important things we wanted to understand are the types of threats that are being experienced across the state that are impacting the energy systems. And so what this map shows us is all of the different threats that have been cited in our engagement with stakeholders. Each of the pies are sized by the number of threats that were cited, and the slices of the pie represent the type of threat that was cited. And what we see here is a trend that starts to emerge. So you might notice in all of these pies across the regions, the slices that are pink, purple, and red tend to be the largest. And so the pink represents winter storm, the purple is windstorm, and red is wildfire. And those 3 threats tend to raise to the top with regard to the level of concern on a pretty consistent basis throughout this project. We also asked folks which energy subsector is most impacted by disruptions. And the most common response was that it was the electricity subsector. This is the bar chart on the left. That's followed by the liquid fuels subsector, specifically in this case, petroleum, and then natural gas. One thing important to note about this figure is that we did have more participation from folks in the liquid fuels private sector relative to the electricity and natural gas subsectors. And so the number of disruptions cited for petroleum might be higher relative to the electricity or natural gas. Another piece of information we ask folks is how long these disruptions tend to last. And you can see that across all 3 of these subsectors, the most common response was that it really lasted about a week's time or less than 7 days. We asked a number of questions related to preparedness. Here, what I'm summarizing is just the presence of backup generators. And you can see that the responses are roughly divided into thirds. So we see that in the blue slice of the pie, those folks know that a generator is available. The yellow is that it is not available. And the gray is that they just don't know if their organization has a generator or not. Something important to note about this is that those that do have a generator have a very wide spectrum with regard to operational capacity. So a few do have generators that can give them full operational capacity, but it can be as low as just offering a safe shutdown. Our last category of feedback is related to environmental justice. And here on the pie chart on the left, we're asking which communities are the highest concern as it relates to environmental justice issues. And the top communities cited are the big blue slice of the pie is low-income community, and then the big yellow slice of the pie is rural communities. And then on the right-hand side, we had we asked them what was the actual impact that's concerning folks or being experienced most frequently. And by far the most commonly cited disruption was power supply disruptions. And this does reflect what we saw earlier, where the electricity subsector is the subsector most often impacted by disruptions. The next most often cited was toxic fume exposure. So We're going to head back to Slido again. This is probably the largest collection of questions we're going to have in one of these breaks. But in general, the first two questions apply to this stakeholder feedback that you've heard thus far. Question number 2 is asking, what have you heard that resonates with you? We want to understand if what other people are telling us, if you agree with it and you say, yeah, you guys are on the right track, you're hearing what's really going on. In contrast, question number 3 asks if there's anything you disagree with. Someone hasn't, what people are telling us right now, you feel like something is missing, or it doesn't align with your experiences or your understanding of the system. So please highlight those areas for us. And then questions 4 through 8 all relate to environmental justice. So again, just trying to gain better understanding of these issues and these communities impacted. So again, we would ask, once you're done answering these questions, if you could raise your hand just to let us know, so that we can get a feel for when you guys are ready to move on. And if any of you have any questions at this point, feel free to just come off mute and let us know any questions or comments. Okay, folks, we'll give you about 1 more minute to wrap up this set of questions. It looks like there are a few people still answering questions. You can obviously keep filling those out in the background, and the Slido will stay open beyond this meeting as well. But let's so that we can aim to wrap up on time in case someone has a hard stop on the hour. We're going to go ahead and move on to the electricity subsector, introducing the preliminary results for the risk assessment now. And as a reminder, we have 41 electric utilities in the state, and many of these utilities serve multiple regions. And so whenever we look at the total number of regions served by different utilities, we can come to what our potential sample size would be across each of the regions. In other words, it's how many utilities would be able to speak to that region and answer our hybrid survey for us. And so this map summarizes our sample size or our N value. It ranges anywhere from 7 to 11. And in the eastern region, you're on the high end with 11 utilities. And so we had about a 50% response rate from the utilities across the state. So we had 20 participate in the survey out of those 41. Important to note that the 3 IOUs did all participate in the survey. And here we can see our actual sample size with these circles in the map. So ranging between 4 and 9. In the eastern region, we had 6 participate. So here we have our final vulnerability rankings in the form of a matrix. So across the top, you have each of the regions, and across the side, you have the different threats that have been evaluated. Then we just put a little box around Eastern so that your eye can go to that quickly. And I'm going to walk through this, just some of the highlights of these findings for you. First of all, it's important to note that the electricity subsector most often prioritized 4 threats in their responses with us. And that included cyber attack, and then those 3 threats that we talked about earlier that were consistently rising to the top. So that's wildfire, windstorm, and winter storm. All of the cells that are outlined in this slide, these are some of the higher rankings across the regions for a given threat. And in this case, we're looking at Cascadia, flood, lightning, wildfire, winter storm, all of those have regions with their results outlined, and all of these tended to be driven by exposure and impact. So from this, you can deduce that your ratings for exposure and impact were lower relative to these other regions. And then in this case, we're looking at Portland Metro for drought. This higher ranking was largely driven by adaptive capacity. So again, you can deduce that your school ranking or rating for adaptive capacity was stronger than it was in the Portland Metro region for drought. And there are a few key points to highlight with regard to the human caused threats. So cyber attack and physical attack. First of all, this feedback is largely dominated by the smaller utilities. So while the IOUs did engage with us and complete the surveys, they actually opted not to give us very much information as it relates to cyber attack and physical attack. Additionally, the higher scores or the higher rankings for these are largely driven by the categories of exposure and impact. And then you'll notice that a couple of the results are in bold and underlined, and that includes the results for your region, Eastern, as well as Portland Metro. And we know that these scores are artificially low. This is because we've got no information from any of the utilities with regard to impact as it relates to cyber attacks or physical attack. So had we had any information on impact, we know there would have been a score or a rating for that category, but we didn't. And so these scores are artificially low. And one thing that you might notice is that we don't see a lot of variability across the regions for a given threat. We see more of the variability across the threats for a given region. But what we can do is look at some of the more nuanced data to identify where that variability does lie. And this is why I want to show you some of the results for adaptive capacity. So I'm going to walk you through how we structured the feedback for adaptive capacity and show you how you can interpret some of these results. Now, this table, you do not have to read all of this. Please don't feel overwhelmed when you see this slide. If you want to look at it in detail, it is in your handout. So you're welcome to look at the details there. The big takeaway here is that we presented this table to the utilities. And what we do here is we assign 5 categories of measures that can be adopted to mitigate risk as it relates to cyber. And the categories include identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these are just examples in this table of what some of those measures look like. And so we present this table to the utilities, and then we ask them, across these 5 categories, how do you rate the level of maturity of your implementation of these measures? And so on the very low end of maturity, we have that it's just now evolving. And so they have the document in place, but it's not fully integrated yet. And then we have embedding, which would be a mid-level of maturity. So it's beginning to get integrated into your processes. And then on the high end, we have optimizing. So this is where you would really be a leader in your field as it relates to this risk and this adaptive measure. And so we asked for each of these 5 categories to be rated with regard to maturity. And we're going to use a color scheme through all of the slides that relate to adaptive capacity moving on. And so on the low end for evolving, you're going to have a really light shade of teal and orange. And then as you get more mature up to optimizing, it's going to be a very dark shade of teal and orange. And so what we can do is compile all the information that we receive and put it into these nice little figures so that we get a snapshot of the maturity and can start to identify some of the trends. And so on this slide, you have cyber attack on the left and you have physical attack on the right. You can see that for each of these, we have those same 5 categories of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And the darker shades again represent this optimized level of maturity, very high maturity with regard to implementation. And so what we're training our eye to do is look for those lighter shades. And so what you can see is that for cyber attack in the Eastern region, the categories of detect, respond, and recover show areas that have the potential for growth. And then with physical attack, the category of identify has the highest potential for growth. So we can do the same thing for the natural hazards. So here we have a different set of categories of measures that can be implemented. So we have, first of all, this figure, it represents windstorms specifically, and these are physical measures. And these results are specific to the Eastern region. And so we have harden, so that could be something like using a fire protective coating. And we have redundancy, so like we mentioned before, backup generator, alternate routes. Remove, so actually taking that infrastructure out of the hazard zone. Upgrade, maybe you have a water pump, but you're going to increase the efficiency of that pump. And then weatherize, adding something like storm windows. And so again here, the darker shades represent that optimized high level of maturity. And so we're looking for those lighter shades to indicate where there's more opportunity for growth. And so you might notice that we have evolving, that lower level of maturity indicated for harden, redundancy, upgrade, and weatherize. So one last grouping of measures here. Again, we're looking at windstorm, specifically in the Eastern region, and these are operational measures now. And so we have the continuity of operations plan. So this is ensuring that operations will continue amidst different circumstances. We have the emergency operation plan. And so understanding which entities play what roles when. The emergency response plan, what steps are going to be followed under different circumstances, different emergencies. And the integrity safety plan, so assessing and mitigating the risks associated with a given threat. And then finally, we have situational awareness, so understanding what's going on amidst an emergency. And so again, we're looking for these lighter shades. You can see that we actually have quite a bit of opportunity for maturing these measures across all 5 of these categories as it relates to windstorm in your region. So what I'm going to do is just highlight a few key takeaways from these findings, not to overwhelm you with these bar charts. I'll just highlight a couple of these areas to kind of just put it on your radar. And so on the left-hand side, we have physical measures. On the top is drought. On the bottom is wildfire. So again, just training your eye to look for those lighter shades. On the top, you might notice harden, redundancy, and particularly remove have a lot of opportunity for growth. And then in the bottom for wildfire, really across all 5 of these categories, we don't have optimized very often, and there are the evolving rating consistently across all 5 categories. On the right-hand side, we have operational measures. The top is drought again, and then the bottom is the Cascadia. And so again, you can see for both of these types of threats, a lot of opportunity for maturing these measures really across all 5 of the categories. So that's going to end our summary of the electricity preliminary results for the risk assessment. And we're going to repeat these questions that we asked with regard to stakeholder engagement. So question number 9 is asking, what have you seen so far that really strongly resonates with you? You definitely agree with it. You want to affirm what we're seeing. And question number 10 is anything you disagree with. It's not in line with what you understand to be going on or something's missing. So again, let's take a minute for you guys to spend some time in Slido and raise your hand again when you're done so we get a feel for when folks are wrapping up. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to just come off mic. It will give you one more minute to wrap up these questions. Okay, so we are now going to move on to the natural gas subsector. So we'll start again with who has been informing these results. And so we have three service providers throughout the state, and each of these do serve multiple regions. So our potential sample size is somewhere between 1 and 3. And we did have responses from all of the service providers in the state. So our actual sample size matched our potential sample size. In your region, it was 2. So again, jumping into these final vulnerability rankings, and in the natural gas subsector, the threats that were most often prioritized were the human-caused threats, so cyber attack and physical attack. And some of the key takeaways in these findings, here we're highlighting the higher rankings that were largely driven by exposure. So you can see that for the eastern region, cyber attack and lightning, your ratings for exposure tended to be higher than some of your neighbors. And here, wildfire in the Southwest, this was largely driven by impact. And so relative to the other regions, you can see that your score for impact would have been lower relative to that region. And actually, all of the regions, there's little variability across these regions other than the Southwest. And then here we have the physical attack responses. These scores are largely driven by exposure and adaptive capacity. And something important to point out about physical attack is that we learned from the natural gas providers after the survey that they considered events such as when someone is digging and they accidentally hit a gas pipeline. They considered that in their responses to physical attack. And so that could have influenced the outcome in some way. So we can go ahead and jump right in to their responses for adaptive capacity. And by and large, the feedback we got from the natural gas providers is that they are already optimized in the measures. And this was really a strong trend for both the human-caused threats and the natural hazards. And so here you can see an example of this with cyber attack on the left, 100% optimized across the state for all 5 categories. The physical attack responses, however, do show some clear opportunities for growth. And so you can see that identify, protect, and detect all have reported lower levels of maturity. So jumping into mini bar charts for the natural hazards in natural gas subsector. On the left-hand side, we have physical measures, and we have the Cascadia on the top, flood in the middle, and then wind storm on the bottom. This is just highlighting for Cascadia and flood, we do have some reports of lower level maturity across some of these measures. And then on the very bottom for windstorm, you might notice that we only have 4 bars in the bar chart. And this is because we got no feedback at all related to remove. And so, you know, there could be many reasons why that isn't a measure that's being pursued, but it isn't, we didn't get any feedback there. On the right-hand side, we have operational measures specific to Cascadia. And one thing to point out here is situational awareness did tend to score a little bit lower for the Cascadia event. And this was pretty common across the state. That might be a clear area where we could improve our adaptive capacity. So again, jumping right back into these same couple of questions, but now specific to natural gas. So now we're on questions 11 and 12. What do you resonate with? And anything at all that you disagree with. So go ahead and let us know your thoughts there. And again, feel free to come off mic if you have questions or comments. You guys are getting the hang of this. We'll give you about 30 seconds to wrap up these. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to liquid fuels now. So this will be our last round of the risk assessment preliminary results. And we had 13 service providers give us feedback for the survey. And so you can see the sample size here ranging between 7 and 12. In your region, it was 9. I'm sorry, it was 7. And then here we have the vulnerability matrix for liquid fuels. The threats most often prioritized by this subsector were cyber attack and winter storm. And then we can see that these rankings for Cascadia are all driven by impacts. So this would be expected given the proximity to those high and very high hazard areas. And then in the eastern region, we actually saw a number of threats for which a larger value was really driven by adaptive capacity. So this includes flood, lightning, wildfire, windstorm, and winter storm. And so for all of these higher end values relative to some of your neighbors, there's a clear opportunity to implement more of these adaptive capacity measures, which would ultimately lower your overall vulnerability ranking. And then again here, we had some responses where we know the final score is artificially low. So again, it's related to physical attack. You can see these scores that are underlined and bolded. They're all of a value of 3. And this includes in your region. And like we saw with electricity, we simply didn't get any insight into the impacts of physical attacks. And so again, these scores we know are artificially low. So now jumping into the adaptive capacity responses, we do have these for the human caused threats. Again, cyber attack on the left, physical attack on the right. And you might notice that these two figures are identical. So we actually got the exact same responses for both of these threats from the providers. And you can see, you know, maybe the clearest areas for growth would be protect, detect, and recover, but there's opportunities across all 5 of the categories of measures. We couldn't create a similar figure for the natural hazards in liquid fuels because we did do the technical analysis here. So all of that data is structured quite differently. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and head back over to Slido, and we're going to have those same 2 questions with regard to liquid fuels. What resonates with you? What do you disagree with? So questions 13 and 14. This is our last round of these questions, and then we'll move on to the risk mitigation measures. And I will point out all of these vulnerability matrices are in the handout. So if you haven't downloaded that and you want to refer back to it, please feel free to go ahead and access that now. Or if you're just curious to refer back to it, it's they're in there for you. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to wrap up these questions, and we'll move on to our last category of preliminary results. Okay, let's move on to the risk mitigation measures. As I mentioned to you guys earlier, this portion is really going to consist of me teeing up the measures for you, and then we're going to be asking you guys to prioritize them specific to the Eastern region. Before we jump into the actual mitigation measures, I want to just remind all of us that there is a relationship between cost and effectiveness. And so in general, the operational measures tend to have a lower cost associated with them, but they also tend to be a little less effective relative to other measures that could be implemented. Physical measures tend to have a much higher cost, but can also be very, very effective. And so of course, we have several measures all along this spectrum, from efficiency improvements to policy, increasing effectiveness, but sometimes there can be a time delay in getting that implemented. Then of course, all the way up to something like undergrounding and replacing pipes. This could be a very costly measure, but obviously very effective. So from here, we're going to start with these all systems mitigation measures. We're focusing first on the physical measures, and these are very high level. They could apply to any of the subsectors. I'm not going to take the time to read all of these to you word for word. They will be in Slido where you'll be reading them. But just highlighting a few, we're starting with drones in the top left, you know, increasing our ability to maybe inspect during an emergency using drones. We do have several options related to redundancy. Over on the right-hand side, we have system segmentation. That one is, you know, increasing the efficiency of our ability to isolate damaged areas after an event or during an event. And if you scroll down, look down to the bottom, we have protect. This one is specific to the human-caused threats. So remember, we had those 5 categories of mitigation measures, and the protect category tends to have more of those physical measures as a part of it. So something like air gapping or restricting physical access to critical infrastructure. And so that category of measures is included here with the physical measures that could apply to all systems. And so what we're going to ask you to do is, in Slido, we're starting with question 15, and it has all of these measures listed below it. You're just going to drag them up to the top, putting the most important one first and working your way down through them. So number 1 is the highest priority mitigation measure that you feel should be applied in your region. And then as you're looking through them, if there's something missing, you feel like there should be a measure included and you're not seeing it there, question 16 is your opportunity to let us know about that in this survey. So please take a moment for 15 and 16 And again, raise your hand, so we'll get a feel for when you're ready to move on. And please let us know if you have any questions or comments. We'll give you one more minute to wrap up these questions. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the set of operational measures. So we're still at this very high level, looking at all systems, but now focused on this category of operational. We do have, starting off, we have the after action reviews, and we have integration of artificial intelligence. So this can improve the operational plans and monitoring. We have the memorandums of understanding with the government. So, defining what these relationships will look like. On the left-hand side, you'll notice we have several examples of studies that could be carried out. And on the very bottom here, we have maturity. So like we had in the last time, the last slide, this last entry is related specifically to the human caused threats. And so this really can apply across, all of those categories that we continue to refer to for the cyber and physical threats. So we're just looking at, in general, maturing these adaptive measures for those two types of threats. So going back again, just teeing this up for you guys, and you guys are really doing the heavy lifting here. So thank you so much. We're going into Slido again. Questions 17 and 18 are the ones you're focusing on now. 17 is ranking these operational measures for all systems. And then 18 is sharing a measure that you feel like should be there and you didn't see in the list. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll give you about 30 more seconds, but we are going to just keep moving through these risk mitigation measures. You can keep working on the question you're on. We want to make sure we at least introduce all of them before anyone has a hard stop. So we've already introduced these higher level mitigation measures, but we obviously want to get into a little bit more detail as it relates to each of these energy subsectors. So here we have electricity. And in this table, we have a selection of the threats. And so we're looking at the Cascadia event, drought, human-caused threats, wildfire, and windstorm. You'll notice that with drought, we're calling out the smaller providers. This is where we saw more of these opportunities for growth relative to the larger providers. We do have the physical category of measures on the top and then operational on the bottom. The measures that are in bold directly fill a gap that we were able to identify through the stakeholder engagement efforts and analysis. And so those stand out just a little bit for us there. I'll hop over to the questions in Slido just to orient you with what questions we're on. So questions 19 and 20 relate to the physical measures for the electric system. Again, 19 is rating or ranking them, and then 20 is adding any in that you feel are missing. And then 21 and 22 relate to the operational measures. 21 is prioritizing them, and 22 is entering any that you feel are missing. And so give you a minute to start working on these. I'll put the table back up on the screen so that you can have that for reference if you need it. Hey, folks, you guys can keep working on those. I'm gonna go ahead and just continue introducing the mitigation measures so that if anyone has a hard stop again, they'll at least be aware of what we're working through. And so for natural gas, we're focusing on the threats of the Cascadia event, flood, human-caused threats, and windstorm. Again, we have physical on the top, operational on the bottom, and those that are in bold directly fill gaps that we were able to identify through our efforts. And so the questions related to natural gas are going to be questions 23 through 26. And I'll leave that table up on the screen in case you'd like to refer to that as well. I'll give you a couple minutes here and then we'll introduce liquid fuels as well so that we can aim to wrap up for the end of the hour. Yeah, Slido will stay open beyond this meeting, so you're welcome to continue working on it afterwards. I'll go ahead and introduce liquid fuels to you while you're working on all of these. This is our last category of prioritizing mitigation measures. So here we're focused on human-caused threats, lightning, wildfire, wind, and winter storm. And again, divided by physical and operational measures. You guys know the drill. You're in the middle of it. So for the very last section, we're looking at questions 27 through 30. So I'll let you guys work on these for a few more minutes and we'll just wrap up the last few slides. Okay, folks, we have a few minutes left to wrap things up, so you can keep working. Obviously, if you're in the middle of it, thank you so much. I just want to let you know where we're headed next is once we finish this roadshow, the series of meetings to get the feedback that you guys are giving us right now. We're going to compile all of that and organize our final risk mitigation measures that are suggested across each region. And we'll obviously have a project rolled out once all of that is finalized. And there are a couple of last questions in the Slido as you reach the end. Question 31 focuses on your region specifically. If something wasn't highlighted here or the information presented didn't reflect a priority in your region, please let us know. Question 32 is just open-ended. Any comments or feedback that you have at all is welcome. And question 33 is seeing what we can do or what Odo can do moving forward to meet your needs. So you can give us any responses on those open-ended questions as well. And from here, I'll hand it back over to Odo for final few comments.
Cool. Thank you, Casey. Well, thank you everybody as well for helping us, giving your feedback and your input. I hope you found this, useful. We really appreciate the input. We're trying something different on the typical Zoom meeting and trying to make it more interactive and gain your feedback. So thank you very much for helping us. So the very last thing that I just want to present here is a plug for another project. Oregon Department of Energy has many various ventures and projects and efforts right now, but we wanted everybody to be aware of another one that's pretty significant that's just starting. It's called the Comprehensive State Energy Strategy. And as you can see on the slide here, top line bold, House Bill 3630 from the state legislature directs Odo to develop a state energy strategy, identifying pathways to achieve Oregon's energy policy objectives. And the policy objectives are mostly around decarbonization. So that's another ongoing project that's just starting right now. I wanted to share this with this group. We're sharing this with everybody we talk to sort of, if you're interested in engaging on that project effort, there are meetings that are just kicking off. There's a lot of information that's going to be produced. And so that's a new venture that we're undertaking. You can see the very last bullet says energy resilience, security, market implications. Part of the energy strategy will be influenced by our current energy security plan that we're working on right now. And I work closely with my colleagues in the other half of our shop at Odo, working on the energy strategy. So we're constantly meeting and talking and coordinating and how our project, the energy security plan, will help to inform the energy strategy. And this very last thing about, do you want to learn more about the energy strategy? If so, here's the information, email, webpage, a QR code you can scan with your phone. And there is an upcoming webinar at the beginning of June to learn more if you're interested in that project. All right, that's the end of, pulled it up right on time. We have a few minutes left here. If there's any questions, we're glad to field them now. There's a lot of information. The Slido stays open. So if you want more time to work on that, please do so. That would be totally fine. We'll keep it open for a few days, I think is probably what we'll do. If you want to talk to me directly, that'd be great too. Here's my information, Max Woods, email, phone, Deanna, there she is still in the room. And Tom Cecilia, who's the third member of our team. Tom's not here today, but you can also contact us in many different ways. So love to hear if there's more questions or input or concerns, please give us a call. We talked about the schedule for our project earlier, but just a reminder, we will be delivering our product by the end of September to the Federal Department of Energy. We'll have a webinar just to roll out the results probably in September of the project. And we will kind of immediately get working on 2025 after finishing 2024 and sort of just roll right into all the work we didn't get to, talk to perhaps more folks we haven't talked to, gather more information and keep on working. So thanks again. If there's questions, now's a good time. Like I said, if not, we'll have to just wrap it up here. You can always contact me directly after the meeting. Thanks, everybody. Andrew, you see any questions here?
Yeah, just one about the survey. Do all the fields in the survey need to be filled in so you can submit or send? If it's a required question, you need to basically rank all the potential options to be able to submit a survey. But everything else you can leave blank.
That has a star by it, right?
If it has a star asterisk here, then those questions need to be answered.
And thank you so much for taking the time to rank all of them.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Okay. Wrap this up. Thanks again. Appreciate it. We'll be in touch.
Job, right on time.